The Grand Hall of the Orion Nebula Space Station buzzed with tension. Delegates from countless alien civilizations filled the chamber, their holographic translators glowing softly as they argued in dozens of languages. Towering over them all was Princess Silara of the Zelith Empire, her crystalline skin shimmering under the artificial lights. Known for her unmatched telepathic powers, she was the galaxy's hope for brokering peace between warring factions. But not everyone was thrilled with her presence. "Humans shouldn't even be here," one of Silara's royal guards whispered, his voice low but dripping with disdain. His violet eyes glanced at Sergeant Dax Riker, the lone human in the security detail. Riker leaned casually against a wall, his combat armor worn but functional. He wasn't bothered by the snide remark. He'd heard worse. Humans, being one of the younger species in the Galactic Assembly, were often dismissed as inferior by older, more advanced civilizations. Riker was here on orders, and orders were all he cared about. The princess didn't even glance at him. To her, he was just another primitive soldier assigned to guard her, a formality dictated by protocol. Her focus was on the negotiations, and for good reason. The rogue Caliph faction had declared open war on the Galactic Assembly, and their latest attacks were edging the galaxy closer to chaos. As the summit began, Silara's telepathic aura spread across the room. She projected calm and reason, silencing the bickering diplomats. The Zelith were admired for this ability, their minds capable of influencing emotions and fostering cooperation. Silara's words were measured, her presence regal. For a moment, it seemed peace might be possible. Then the first explosion rocked the station. The lights flickered, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Shouts erupted as the security alarms blared. Silara's guards immediately surrounded her, their plasma weapons drawn. Across the room, Riker's hand instinctively went to his rifle. "Caliph attack!" Someone screamed. Another explosion tore through the hall, and the diplomatic chamber descended into chaos. Smoke filled the air, and the sharp crackle of weapons fire echoed through the station. Delegates scrambled for cover as the Caliph, hulking insectoid warriors armed with deadly plasma cannons, stormed into the room. "Protect the princess," barked the Zelith captain. Silara's guards moved in formation, but it was clear they were unprepared for an ambush of this scale. The Caliph advanced with terrifying speed, their claws slicing through anything in their path. Riker, however, was already moving. "Get her out of here," he shouted over the noise, his voice cutting through the panic. The Zelith captain hesitated. Who was this human to give orders? But before he could protest, Riker was already in action. He dove into the fray, firing precise bursts from his rifle. Each shot found its mark, dropping Caliph warriors with military precision. Silara's eyes widened as she watched him fight. His movements were swift, calculated, unlike anything she had seen. While her guards hesitated, Riker acted. "This way," Riker shouted, motioning for the princess to follow him. For a moment, Silara hesitated. Was she really going to trust a human over her own elite guards? But as another Caliph blast narrowly missed her, the decision was made for her. She ran. Riker led the way, his instincts honed from years of battlefield experience. The halls of the space station were a maze of smoke and fire, but he navigated them effortlessly. Behind him, Silara struggled to keep up, unused to such physical exertion. "Why aren't we waiting for the others?" she demanded, her voice sharp with frustration. "Because they'll be dead in 5 minutes if we don't keep moving." Riker shot back without looking at her. Silara bristled at his tone but couldn't deny the truth in his words. She could sense the fear and desperation of her guards fading, their minds succumbing to the Caliph assault. They rounded a corner, only to come face to face with another squad of Caliph. Before Silara could react, Riker shoved her behind him and opened fire. His shots were precise, each one hitting critical points on the alien warriors. The Caliph fell, but not without returning fire. A blast struck the wall near Riker, sending sparks flying. He stumbled but stayed on his feet. "Stay close," he growled, pulling her along. Finally, they reached an auxiliary escape pod bay. Riker sealed the doors behind them and turned to Silara, breathing heavily. "Get in," he ordered, pointing to the pod. Silara hesitated. She wasn't used to taking commands, especially from someone she considered beneath her. But as she looked at Riker, bruised, bloodied, and utterly unyielding, something inside her shifted. Without a word, she climbed into the pod. Riker followed, securing the hatch just as the Caliph began pounding on the doors. As the pod launched into the void of space, Silara finally spoke. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Riker leaned back, exhaustion evident on his face. "Don't thank me yet, Princess. This is just the beginning." The escape pod hurtled through the blackness of space, its emergency thrusters firing as it raced away from the destruction of the Orion Nebula space station. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the pod's engines and the occasional beep from the control panel. Sergeant Dax Riker sat in the pilot's seat, his brow furrowed as he tried to get a sense of their location. Beside him, Princess Silara was tense, her hands gripping the armrests, her mind still clouded with the chaos they had just escaped. "Where are we?" Silara's voice was calm, but laced with frustration. Riker glanced at the readout. "Unknown. Pod's got no navigation data, just an emergency course. We're probably far off the map." He adjusted the controls, but the pod's descent was inevitable. The planet below was big, its surface rough and dotted with mountains and vast stretches of barren land. No signs of civilization, no signs of anything useful. "Brace yourself," Riker warned, and with that, the pod slammed into the planet's atmosphere. The sudden jolt threw Silara forward, and she gripped her seat tighter, trying to steady herself. The pod rocked violently, shaking as it plummeted toward the unknown world below. Riker's calm was unshaken. He worked the controls with practiced ease, trying to steer the pod in a controlled crash. With a loud crash and a screech of metal on rock, the pod finally came to a halt, skidding across the rough terrain before tipping over and coming to a final, jarring stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim red glow across the cabin. Riker groaned and slowly unstrapped himself from his seat. His body ached from the crash, but he was used to it. He glanced at Silara, who was still seated, her face pale but otherwise unharmed. "We're alive," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Silara slowly stood, her legs unsteady. The princess had been through battles and royal duties, but this was something else entirely. The terror and confusion of crashing on an unknown world had shaken her confidence. She was used to commanding, used to being the one in control. But here, in this strange place, she felt powerless. "Is the pod still operational?" she asked, her voice cool but laced with concern. Riker gave the control panel a glance. "For now, but I'm guessing no one's coming to rescue us anytime soon." He stood up and grabbed his gear. "We need to get moving." Silara blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of his statement. He wasn't the type to sugarcoat things, but she knew he was right. She had no idea where they were, and standing around wasn't going to help. Reluctantly, she followed him out of the pod. The ground outside was rocky, and the air was thick with a strange, unfamiliar scent. It wasn't unbreathable, but it wasn't exactly pleasant either. Riker scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes catching details he couldn't even begin to process. "We need to find shelter, food, and water," he said, already moving with purpose. Silara hesitated for a moment. She was a princess, an important figure, trained to rely on others, her royal guards, her people, and her telepathic abilities. But here, on this alien world, she was alone with a human soldier. And for all her telepathic power, there was no one to reach up to for help. No one except Riker. He was already several steps ahead of her, moving swiftly across the rugged terrain. Silara swallowed her pride and hurried to catch up. The land they traveled through was desolate. Jagged mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. The ground was uneven, and strange creatures could be heard in the distance, but they remained hidden, avoiding the two travelers. "Are you sure we're heading in the right direction?" Silara asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Riker didn't look back. "I'm not sure of anything, but we can't just stand around here. We'll find something soon enough." Hours passed, and the sun of the unknown planet began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren land. Riker had led them to a small valley, where the ground was softer and a thin stream of water trickled through the rocks. "It's not much, but it'll do for now," Riker said, kneeling beside the stream and filling a canteen. Silara knelt beside him, her mind buzzing with questions, but she knew better than to ask too many at once. They needed to keep moving, keep surviving. "Are you going to eat?" Riker asked, noticing she hadn't touched the rations he'd offered earlier. "I'm not hungry," she replied, though her stomach growled in protest. The idea of eating with him, a human, after everything that had happened felt strange. "You'll need to eat if we're going to keep going," Riker said, his tone more a command than a suggestion. Silara opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again. He was right. She could feel her strength waning, the exhaustion from the crash, and the long hours of travel settling into her limbs. With a reluctant sigh, she accepted the ration bar he offered. The food was bland and tasteless, but it was enough to quiet her hunger. As they settled down for the night beside the stream, Riker kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. Silara, though exhausted, couldn't sleep. She had never felt so vulnerable. Her people were a powerful empire, but here, on this world, she was just another survivor, no more important than the human soldiers sitting beside her. As the stars filled the sky above them, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded, and they would have to rely on each other if they were going to make it out of this alive. The days that followed were long and grueling. Riker and Princess Silara pushed through the harsh terrain of the alien planet, surviving on meager rations and the water they could find in the sparse streams. The once clear sky was now often overcast, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. The planet, though beautiful in its strange way, was beginning to feel like a trap. Riker was quiet but focused, always looking ahead, scanning the environment for any signs of danger. Silara, on the other hand, was preoccupied with trying to reach out mentally for help, but no matter how hard she concentrated, her telepathic abilities remained blocked by something she couldn't understand. It wasn't just the planet's wild creatures that posed a threat, but something more, something hidden. "Do you ever rest?" Silara asked one evening as Riker set up camp, his movements efficient and practiced. "Resting will get us killed out here," he replied without looking up, his voice sharp but not unkind. "We need to stay alert." Silara sat down beside the fire, a mix of frustration and curiosity rising in her chest. The journey had been harder than she had expected, both physically and mentally. She had always been the one in control, the one who guided others. Yet here, on this alien world, she felt helpless. Riker's strength, his ability to keep moving without showing any signs of doubt or exhaustion, made her feel inadequate. She watched him work, silently admiring the soldier's calm and methodical approach. Despite his rough exterior, there was something about him that made her question her assumptions about humans. "Tell me," Silara began, breaking the silence, "why do you fight so hard to survive?" Riker paused, a flicker of something in his eyes. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he checked his gear and prepared a weapon, as if buying time. Finally, he looked at her. "Because it's the only thing I know how to do," he said simply. "Survive. Keep going until there's nothing left to fight for." Silara stared at him for a long moment, processing his words. She could feel the weight of his experiences, the scars of battles fought and comrades lost, though he hadn't shared any details. There was an unspoken bond in those words, one that felt deeper than their current predicament. As the night deepened, The quiet hum of the planet's wildlife filled the air. Strange sounds echoed from the distant forests, but none of them seemed close enough to pose a threat. Yet, something about the silence of the land was unnerving. It wasn't the usual peace of nature. It felt like the calm before a storm. Riker sat up straighter, his senses on high alert. Solara's hand instinctively reached for the energy blade at her side, though her power felt weak. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Solara frowned, trying to tap into her telepathy. It was there, but faint, like a whisper in her mind she couldn't quite catch. Her power, once a tool to calm her people, now felt distant, beyond her reach. "I feel something," she said slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. "But it's not clear. I can't focus." Riker's eyes narrowed as he stood, moving silently into the shadows. Solara followed him, though her steps were slower and more uncertain. It wasn't fear she felt. There was something worse, a sense of being watched. He motioned for her to stay close and pulled out his rifle. The air around them felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Then, from the corner of her eye, Solara saw movement. Fast, too fast. "Behind you," she shouted. But it was too late. A massive creature, its skin dark and reflective like a beetle's, leaped from the shadows, crashing into Riker with a deafening screech. It was bigger than anything she had seen on this planet, its razor-sharp claws glinting in the firelight. "Stay back," Riker ordered, grappling with the creature, trying to push it off of him. The thing was relentless, twisting and thrashing like a beast born of nightmares. Solara's heart raced as she tried to focus, but her telepathy still felt clouded, useless against the chaos of the attack. Riker was struggling, but he wasn't going to give up. She could see it in his eyes. He wouldn't stop fighting. Without thinking, she lunged at the creature, drawing her energy blade with a sudden surge of desperation. She had to help. She had to do something. The blade hummed with power, but her aim was off. The creature spun, slashing at her with one of its massive claws, grazing her arm. She cried out in pain, but didn't back down. Riker, using all his strength, managed to knock the creature back with a powerful punch. He didn't wait to see if it would recover. With a swift motion, he aimed his rifle and fired. The blast hit the creature square in the chest, and it let out an ear-piercing screech before collapsing into the dirt. Silence fell over the camp once more. Riker stood over the fallen beast, panting heavily. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his face hard, but his eyes searching for any further danger. "Are you all right?" he asked, not turning to face her. Solara looked at the wound on her arm, the blood dripping slowly but not life-threatening. She clenched her teeth, her body aching. "I'm fine," she replied. It wasn't the first time she had been injured, but this time it felt different. This time, she felt more vulnerable than she ever had before. And for the first time, she realized just how much she relied on Riker. "Good," he said, glancing at her briefly before scanning the surroundings once more. "Stay alert. There's more out there. This planet isn't just hostile because of the creatures. We're dealing with something worse." Solara frowned. "What do you mean?" Riker's eyes hardened. "There's something controlling them. I've been seeing patterns, hearing noises that don't make sense. This isn't random." As the stars twinkled above them, Solara felt a chill run down her spine. She had been sensing it too, the presence of something far more dangerous than just wild animals. She had a feeling that the real danger on this planet wasn't the creatures they could see, but the ones they couldn't yet understand. The days following the attack were tense. Riker and Solara had become more cautious, moving through the strange terrain with heightened awareness. The peaceful calm of the planet, which had once seemed like a quiet refuge, now felt oppressive, like a looming threat waiting to strike. Their journey took them deeper into the valley, where the land was barren and the wildlife had begun to behave oddly. No longer were they hearing the usual calls of animals or insects. Instead, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the bushes or the distant, haunting howls in the night. It felt like the planet itself was holding its breath. Solara's arm, though not life-threatening, had taken longer to heal than she had expected. The wound throbbed, especially at night, but she refused to show any weakness. She couldn't afford to. Riker relied on her as much as she relied on him, even if she hadn't fully admitted it yet. They reached a dense forest by midday. The trees here were massive, their trunks twisted and gnarled, towering high above them. The canopy blocked out most of the sun, casting the forest floor in shadow. It was colder here, and the air had a strange metallic scent that clung to everything. "This place doesn't feel right," Riker said, his voice low as he scanned their surroundings. His eyes flicked back to Solara. "Stay close." Solara nodded, though she could feel the stirrings of unease inside her. She had been able to sense something was off for a while now, but the feeling had only grown stronger in the forest. The trees loomed overhead like silent watchers, and the deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. They continued their trek, wary of every sound and movement. Hours passed, and the forest grew thicker, more difficult to navigate. Riker led the way, his rifle raised, his senses sharp. Solara followed closely behind, her mind alert, though still clouded by her inability to tap into her telepathic abilities. "Something's watching us," Solara muttered under her breath, barely louder than a whisper. Riker didn't respond, but the tension in his posture said it all. He had felt it too, the feeling of being hunted, of eyes following their every move. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the bushes ahead. Both of them froze. Solara instinctively reached for her energy blade, but Riker's hand shot out, stopping her. "Wait," he whispered, his voice urgent. "It's too quiet." The rustling stopped. Silence. Then, from the shadows between the trees, something emerged. A figure, humanoid in shape, but unlike anything they had seen before. It was tall, with a thin, elongated body. Its skin was a deep shade of green, covered in a slick, almost reflective layer. Its eyes were large and dark, like black pools of ink, watching them intently. "Riker." Solara's voice faltered as she stepped back, fear creeping into her chest. She had never felt fear like this, not even during her own Empire's battles. This was something else. The creature didn't move at first, its gaze locked on them. Then it spoke, though not with words. There was no voice, no sound. Instead, it was a feeling, a wave of emotion that flooded their minds. Fear, anger, hunger. Riker's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't fire. He wasn't sure what this thing was, and the last thing they needed was to start a fight without understanding their enemy. The creature stepped forward, slow and deliberate. It was close now, too close. Solara's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her heart racing. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the trees, its presence fading like a shadow swallowed by the night. "What was that?" Solara breathed, her voice shaking. Riker didn't answer right away. He kept his rifle raised, scanning the darkened forest. "I don't know," he muttered, but it wasn't alone. Before Solara could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the forest, shaking the very air around them. The trees above swayed, and the ground cracked open in a series of violent tremors. Riker instinctively grabbed Solara's arm, pulling her toward the nearest shelter, a cluster of large rocks. "Get down," he shouted. They ducked behind the rocks as the earth split open, a massive creature bursting from the ground. It was a massive, insect-like thing, its legs long and spindly, and its body covered in thick, armored plates. It had no eyes, but it seemed to sense them, its head jerking toward their hiding place. Riker's hand tightened around his rifle as he prepared to fire, but before he could, a second creature emerged, and then another. They were surrounded. Solara's heart raced. These weren't just beasts, the first creature they had seen, the one with the reflective skin. It was different. These creatures were connected. She could feel it, a strange, almost psychic bond between them, and it was growing stronger. "We need to move," Riker said through clenched teeth. "This is a trap." But Solara wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere. She closed her eyes, focusing hard, trying to reach out with her telepathic abilities. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The connection between the creatures wasn't just a feeling. She could sense it, feel the web that tied them together, a dark force far beyond anything she had ever experienced. The creatures in the forest seemed to sense it too. They stopped moving, their attention shifting toward Solara. And in that moment, she felt something else, something even darker than the creatures themselves. A presence deep in the forest, hidden just beyond her reach. The shadow had come alive. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the creatures stood still, their insect-like forms twitching as if they too were sensing something in the air. Solara's mind raced, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had felt the connection between the creatures, but now something far more sinister was looming. The dark presence she had sensed was no longer a vague feeling in the back of her mind. It was here, pressing in on her, growing stronger with each passing second. Riker was alert, his rifle raised, his stance defensive. He kept his eyes locked on the creatures, but Solara could tell that he too was feeling the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just another attack. It was something far more dangerous. "Riker," Solara whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "There's something else here. Something controlling them." Riker didn't take his eyes off the creatures, his finger tightening on the rifle's trigger. "I know. I feel it too. But we don't have time to figure it out right now. We need to move." Solara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how they could escape. These creatures, these things, weren't just random beasts of the forest. They were a force, tied together by something far darker than anything she had encountered in her life. She could feel their connection to whatever was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. One of the creatures shifted suddenly, jerking forward with a speed that caught them off guard. Riker's rifle fired, but the shot only grazed the creature's armored hide, leaving it unharmed. The creature screeched and lunged forward, its long, spindly legs reaching out with terrifying precision. "Run," Riker shouted, pulling Solara by the arm as he darted into the woods. They sprinted through the dense underbrush, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Solara struggled to keep up, her injured arm still aching from the earlier attack. But she didn't dare fall behind. She couldn't, not with the creatures closing in behind them. The sounds of pursuit echoed through the trees, scraping legs, clicking mandibles, and the occasional screech. It was as though the creatures had learned from the first attack. They were no longer clumsy, no longer just reacting. They were hunting. "Keep moving," Riker yelled, not looking back as he pushed forward through the thickening woods. The trees above them grew taller and closer together, blocking out much of the sky. They were being funneled deeper into the heart of the forest. There was no escape. Solara's thoughts raced. She could sense the creatures, feel their movements, feel their awareness. The connection between them was undeniable now, and as she reached deeper into her mind, she realized something even more terrifying. This wasn't just an animal instinct they shared. These creatures were linked by something more intelligent, something ancient. It was a hive mind, a collective consciousness, and it was growing stronger. They broke through the trees and came into a clearing, wide, open, and vulnerable. Riker skidded to a stop, his rifle raised, but there was no immediate threat. It was quieter now. Too quiet. "What is it?" Solara gasped, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Riker's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. He crouched low, motioning for her to do the same. The clearing was surrounded by high rocks, jagged and sharp, with sparse vegetation scattered across the ground. It looked like a trap, but there was no way to turn back now. The creatures were closing in, and the only option was to fight or die. Solara could feel them coming. She could sense their presence moving through the trees, growing closer. Her pulse quickened as her mind reached out again, trying to make sense of the strange, dark energy that hung in the air. Suddenly, from the shadows of the trees, a shape emerged. It was humanoid, tall and cloaked in shadow. Its features were hard to make out, but it exuded an aura of power that made Solara's blood run cold. The creatures had stopped moving, frozen in place, their attention fixed on the figure that now stood in the clearing. Riker didn't hesitate. He fired his rifle at the figure, but the shot seemed to pass right through it, as if the figure wasn't even there. "What the hell?" Riker muttered, his hand tightening around the rifle. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the area. The air was thick with tension, and the forest felt alive with something ancient and terrifying. The figure stepped forward again, moving with fluid grace. It wasn't a creature, not in the way the others had been. There was no sign of physicality, no flesh or bones. It was something more ethereal, something far more dangerous. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't heard with ears. It resonated in their minds, cold and heavy. "You should not have come here." Solara froze. The voice was deep, otherworldly, and filled with an undeniable authority. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a random encounter. The forest, the creatures, everything. It was all part of a larger, darker force. Riker raised his rifle again, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Who are you?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it reached out, its form shifting and swirling in the air. For a moment, it looked almost human, tall and imposing, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness of the forest. "I am the Guardian," it finally said. "This place is mine to protect. And you, intruders, will not leave." The air crackled with dark energy as the figure's presence grew stronger. The creatures around them stirred, more restless now, as if waiting for its command. Solara felt a surge of fear. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight against something ancient, something far older and more powerful than either of them could imagine. "We have to leave," Riker said, his voice grim. "Now." But there was no escape. The Guardian's presence was everywhere, closing in on them from all sides, and with each passing second, Solara could feel the creature's collective mind growing stronger, closer to the will of the Guardian. They were trapped, and the forest had begun to close in around them. The air in the clearing grew colder, heavier, as the Guardian's presence stretched over them like a dark cloud. Riker's grip tightened on his rifle, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't do much good. This wasn't a fight they could win with weapons. This was something else, something beyond them. Solara stood beside him, her heart pounding. She could feel the power of the Guardian seeping into the air, wrapping around her like an invisible force. The creatures, still lurking in the shadows, waited for the Guardian's command. They were like mindless puppets, and the Guardian was the puppet master. Riker's eyes flicked around, searching for any way out. The rocks around the clearing formed a natural barrier, and the trees surrounding them were dense, but there was no clear path through them. There was no escape. The only way out was through the Guardian, and that didn't seem likely. "We can't fight this," Riker muttered, almost to himself. His eyes locked onto Solara's. "We need a plan." Solara's mind raced. She could feel the Guardian's presence growing stronger, pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. It was like a wall of darkness, pushing against her telepathic abilities, making it harder and harder to think clearly. Then a flicker of hope sparked in her mind. "We don't need to fight," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We just need to distract it. If we can break its focus, maybe we can escape." Riker looked at her, doubt flickering in his eyes. "How?" "I have an idea," Solara said, her voice low. "But you need to trust me." Before Riker could respond, the Guardian stepped forward again, its form shifting with an eerie grace. It wasn't just a figure now. It was an overwhelming presence, like an ancient god risen from the depths of the earth. The creatures, the insects, the beasts, they all began to move at once, their dark eyes fixed on them. "You will not escape," the guardian's voice echoed in their minds, cold and unyielding. "This land is mine to protect. You do not belong here." Riker's hand tightened on his rifle, but Solara grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "Don't," she said urgently. "We can't fight it. But I can sense something. It's vulnerable." Riker frowned. "Vulnerable? It doesn't look vulnerable to me." Solara didn't have time to explain. The Guardian was getting closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of its power growing stronger, ready to crush them both. But there was one thing the Guardian hadn't counted on: the unique power of a royal mind. In a split second, Solara closed her eyes and focused, pushing past the crushing mental barrier the Guardian had created. She had no idea how long it would last, but she had to try. The creatures around them screeched, their bodies twitching in response to her telepathic push. For a moment, Solara felt a connection, a link between the Guardian and the creatures. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Riker," she said, her voice shaky but determined, "I need you to move. Distract them. Get their attention. Do whatever it takes." He didn't hesitate. With a sharp nod, he sprinted forward, firing his rifle into the air. The loud shots echoed through the clearing, sending the creatures into a frenzy. They began to move, racing toward him, their claws and mandibles snapping. Solara could feel their confusion. The Guardian had to be aware of the sudden shift in its creature's behavior. She pushed harder, her mind stretching, reaching toward the Guardian's core, looking for its weak spot. She could sense it. The Guardian wasn't just a being of pure power. There was something holding it in place, something keeping it tethered to the land. It was afraid. For a moment, Solara faltered. Could fear be the key? Could she use it against the Guardian? She wasn't sure, but she had no other choice. Riker kept firing, drawing the creature's attention away from Solara, but they were fast, too fast. He darted between the rocks, using them for cover, but there were too many, and Solara knew it wouldn't be long before the Guardian would turn its focus back on them. Focus, she told herself. She could do this. In a final surge of energy, Solara reached deep into the Guardian's mind. The darkness was suffocating, but she fought against it, pushing her power through every crack, every weakness she could find. She felt its resistance, like an immovable wall, but her mind pressed forward, relentless. Then she found it, a crack, a small gap in the Guardian's control. With a sharp thrust, she forced her way through. The Guardian's mind recoiled, and for a split second, Solara saw it clearly. It wasn't just a creature of power. It was something older, ancient, bound to the land, its existence tied to this forest and the creatures it controlled. It had been guarding this place for eons, and it had learned to fear nothing. Except one thing: change. Solara pushed harder, using that fear against it. She could feel the Guardian faltering, its grip on the creatures loosening. "Riker," she shouted, her voice trembling with effort. Now. Riker was already moving, charging straight toward the center of the clearing. The creatures, still confused by the distraction, were momentarily scattered. The Guardian, its mind now split between the battle and Solara's psychic push, was weakened, vulnerable. In one final push, Solara focused all her energy into breaking the Guardian's hold on the land. A burst of mental energy shot outward, crackling through the air. The ground trembled, and the creatures screeched, retreating into the forest as the power of the Guardian began to fade. For a moment, there was silence. The Guardian's form wavered, flickering like a dying flame. Solara's vision blurred from the strain, and she staggered, her legs giving way beneath her. But she didn't fall. Not yet. The Guardian's voice echoed in their minds one last time, filled with a mix of fury and fear. "This land will reclaim you." And then, just like that, It was gone. The creatures vanished with it, retreating into the shadows. Riker rushed to Silora's side, his face hard, but filled with something like respect. "You did it," he said, his voice low. Silora looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "We did it." But as she looked around the empty clearing, she knew this wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. The clearing was still. The creatures were gone. The Guardian's presence had faded like a nightmare evaporating at dawn. But the sense of unease lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Silora leaned against a rock, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The mental strain had left her exhausted, her mind fuzzy and distant. But they had done it. They had survived. Riker was already scanning the perimeter, his rifle held ready. He was always alert, always prepared for the next danger. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was something more at play here, something they hadn't yet uncovered. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but concerned as he approached Silora. Silora nodded slowly, though the fatigue in her eyes was evident. "I'm fine," she replied, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't fine. She knew that, and Riker did too. But they couldn't afford to focus on it. Not now. "What was that thing?" Riker asked, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've never seen anything like it." Silora took a deep breath, pushing herself off the rock to stand. She glanced around the clearing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The Guardian, the creatures, it was all connected. But how? And why had it all happened now, when they were so far from any known civilization? "I'm not sure," she said, shaking her head. It wasn't just some random creature or guardian. It was something ancient, tied to the land. Something that's been here for centuries, maybe longer. Riker raised an eyebrow. "So what? This place is cursed or something?" Silora hesitated, then nodded. It might be more than that. The Guardian wasn't just protecting the forest. It was protecting something. I could feel it. There's something deeper here, something the Guardian was trying to keep hidden. Riker's gaze sharpened. "You think it's still here? Whatever the Guardian was guarding?" "I don't know," Silora said, her voice tense. "But I think we need to find out." She felt a pull inside her, a need to understand the source of the Guardian's power. The forest, the land itself, it was alive with something more than just ancient creatures. There was a force at its heart, and it called to her. Silora couldn't explain it, but the sense of connection to the land, the pulse of something ancient, it was impossible to ignore. "We can't just leave," she continued, more to herself than to Riker. "Whatever that was, it's not over. Not yet." Riker gave her a long look, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one for philosophy or spiritual talk, but even he had to admit that something was wrong with this planet. There was too much history buried beneath its surface. Too many unanswered questions, and the danger wasn't over. "You're right," he finally said. "We don't know what's really going on here. But if we're going to stay, we need to be careful. I don't think we've seen the last of whatever's out there." Silora looked up at him, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of understanding between them, something that had grown over the past days as they fought side by side. They were more than just allies now. They were survivors. And in a place like this, that was enough. The decision was made. They would press on, deeper into the forest, to find the source of the power that had so violently thrown them into a fight for their lives. But as they started moving, Silora couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't the creatures this time. No, this was something else. As they walked, the forest seemed to close in around them. The shadows grew longer, more menacing. The ground felt softer beneath their feet, like it was alive, shifting with each step they took. Silora's instincts screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to run. But they couldn't. Not when there were answers to find. Hours passed, and the forest became denser, darker. The trees were massive, their trunks twisting and knotted, as though they had been here long before the planet itself had formed. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the faint hum of energy buzzed in the background, like the pulse of a heartbeat. Then, as they rounded a bend in the path, Celera stopped in her tracks. She had felt it again, a pull, a calling, deep within the earth beneath her feet. She looked around, scanning the area, her breath catching in her throat. In the distance, hidden among the trees, was a structure. It was ancient, its stone walls overgrown with vines and moss, but there was no mistaking it. A temple, a place of power. "That's it," Celera whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. "It's here. The source." Riker stopped beside her, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the temple. "What is it?" "I don't know," she replied. "But I feel like we've just found the heart of everything. The Guardian, the creatures, the power that's been controlling them. It all comes from there." The temple loomed before them, dark and foreboding. Celera could feel the energy radiating from it, a force stronger than anything she had ever encountered. It was alive, ancient, and powerful. Riker stepped forward, his hand on his rifle. "Are we going in?" Celera hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "We don't have a choice. Whatever's inside, we need to see it. We need to understand it." With that, they moved toward the temple, their footsteps silent in the thickening gloom. They were about to face whatever lay hidden within, and neither of them knew if they would emerge alive, or if they would emerge at all. But one thing was certain: the war for this planet was far from over.